Hello, everyone. We're going to get started here in just about 20 seconds. So feel free to use the Q&A to tell us where you're from and your class's name, so we know who's joining us this morning. All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the first virtual field trip from the Minnesota Agriculture in the Classroom program of the 2023-24 school year. We're so happy to have you guys here today. We have a few shout outs. So Miss Bishop's third grade class, welcome to you. Mrs. Broman, second graders from Cloquet. We're excited to have you here. Third grade at Yellow Medicine East Schools in Granite Falls, Miss Lightfoot, hello. Miss Ruins, fifth graders from Lanesboro, as well as a few others. Miss Opdahl's class from Heron Lake, hello. My name is Sue Knott. I'm an education specialist with Minnesota Agriculture in the Classroom. And like I said, we're excited to have you here for our first virtual field trip. My team today is Carrie Seidel. Carrie is going to be doing all of the tech work to make sure you can see us and hear us on Zoom and on YouTube. And then Jessica is our camera person who's going to make sure, like I said, we can see our awesome site. You guys, as attendees to this virtual field trip, we hope that you will be engaged with us by putting your questions in the Q&A if you're joining on Zoom, and then using the comment feature in YouTube. If you have any questions, we will try to ask those to our awesome host as we move along on this virtual field trip. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you to Kathryn Jordan. Kathryn is the Organics Recycling Coordinator for Anoka County, and we are joining her, or we're going to go visit her here in just a moment at the Rice Creek Compost site near Lino Lakes, Minnesota. So Kathryn, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and help us learn all about compost.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, Minnesota students. Thank you, Sue, for the great introduction. Like she said, we're here in Lino Lakes, just north of the Twin Cities at the Anoka County Rice Creek Compost site. You kind of see the whole facility behind me, all these piles of colorful mulch, our piles of compost and yard waste. I'm so excited to have you all here. Like Sue said, I'm the Organics Recycling Coordinator, so I help manage these compost sites that we have in the county, and I'm going to teach you all about what happens here at the compost site, and then all about composting and compost and how it's made. So let's dive right in and figure out what is compost. So this pile right next to me is compost. It's a little wet from the rain, but if I dig underneath, it's these nice fine grains, kind of dusty. So compost is essentially just decayed organic matter. So decayed just means broken down into like small pieces. And then organic matter, when we're talking about compost and we're talking about kind of the natural world, organic basically means like anything that is or once was living. So that's like plants, animals, fungus, all those things are organic in the environmental sense. The opposite of that is inorganic. So that's stuff like the air or water or rocks. Those are important parts of the environment, but they're not alive. And so again, compost is just decayed organic matter. And if you look at it, I mean, if you came up to this, you wouldn't know that it's necessarily compost. You might think it's like soil or dirt, right? So think for a second, what do you think the difference is between compost and soil? Well, if you're kind of struggling to figure out the difference between those two, that's okay because they're very, very similar. Compost or organic matter is actually a really important component of soil. And the other portion is that inorganic portion, which is like rocks, which could be like your sands, your clays, and they mix together to create different soils that are naturally occurring, all over the place in your backyard and all around this compost site. But the important part of compost is that it holds on to water really well, which rocks don't really do, and plants really need that water to grow. And additionally, the compost provides nutrients for those plants. Rocks, on the other hand, are very, very stable. They don't really want to freely give away these nutrients to the plants, but compost can. So while rocks, there are inorganic and organic compost mixed together to make soil, compost is kind of the important player here. And we're realizing it's becoming even more important after kind of decades of our agricultural industry relying on synthetic fertilizers. And that's basically like a powdered substance you mix with water and you can spread along your agricultural fields, and your crops will grow just fine, but they'll deplete all those resources afterwards and not really leave anything behind. And then you have to add more and more fertilizer. With compost, you can add that, and it's kind of like a slow release natural fertilizer. And then again, it helps build up the organic material in the soils, so you don't have like compact, sandy clay soil that isn't very good on its own. So compost is a great resource. You can use it in your garden. Like I said, agricultural fields, and even the Department of Transportation actually uses a lot of compost when they finish road projects and then they're reseeding and replanting vegetation alongside of the roads. They use a lot of this compost, so it's very useful. The other
That's
main
awesome.
difference.
Oh, I'm sorry. Continue, Kathryn. We already had a question about how you make compost. So if you want to continue that and then tell us how you guys make compost at your site, that would be fantastic.
Perfect. That's right what I'm getting into. So that's the other thing that you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell just looking at the compost is how it's made is what makes compost special. So that process of how compost is made is called composting. Pretty simple, pretty easy to remember. But the decay of organic material, it happens naturally all around the world. But the problem with the natural decay is that it's really slow, it's really inconsistent, and then we humans can't really go out into a field and like pick up all these tiny little pieces of organic matter and try to, use it in our garden. So we need a controlled process that allows us to make, a big pile of compost like this at once, so then we can use it in multiple ways. So let's dive deeper into that composting process. So I like to think about composting kind of like baking a cake. So we as humans, we're the chefs, right? We get to put all the ingredients together. And just like you're baking a cake and you want to make your batter with your milk and eggs, flour, all those raw ingredients, we also need raw ingredients for our compost. So the two main elements that plants really need to grow is nitrogen and carbon. So if we want our end compost to have high levels of nitrogen and carbon, that means that we need to input raw materials that are high in nitrogen and carbon. So on the carbon side, you can see this big pile of tree waste in front of me. Trees are a great source of carbon, this hard material. But you can see we get some pieces of trees, like tree trunks, that are really, really big. And so just like the flour that you would use in a cake normally comes from a wheat seed that is then ground down into a fine powder so then you can use it to make a cake, we kind of do the same process with our trees. We'll take these tree trunks and we'll chip them down into a mulch like this. Perfect. So yeah, on your screen right now, you'll see a video of our wood chipper in action. It's a really cool machine that just shreds apart all that tree material so it gets down to a small size so we can mix it and use it. So that's the carbon side of our, so that's the tree mulch pile right there. You can see we take big tree trunks and turn it down into like just little slivers. So then we can easily use it.
So we have a question about that, Kathryn. Yeah. Do you chip all of the wood at one time, or do you continuously do that like every day?
It's kind of a continuous process. I mean, this pile of yard waste or tree waste that we got in is quite large. And then the company that contracts out this facility and actually operates it for us, they work on other sites too. So they're constantly cycling their wood chippers around from site to site. It's a constant process. It's probably one of the most labor intensive portions of the composting process is just getting those big tree branches and tree trunks down to a usable size.
Sure, that
Great
makes
question.
sense. Yeah, and I would encourage classrooms and students, feel free to use the Q&A to ask any questions. We love when you ask questions. And if you're in YouTube, use the comment feature. So continuing on, where are we now, Kathryn?
Yeah, so we've got the carbon portion of our recipe, if you will, covered. And then the other component we really need to have a lot of is nitrogen. And so here at Rice Creek, we're able to use people's residential like kitchen food scraps as our nitrogen source. So here's a look inside our collection dumpster for the food scraps. Again, looking through these bags, you can see maybe that looks like some fruit peelings. Maybe looks like some coffee grounds in this bag. We've got some napkins, some chips. We've even got this big watermelon. Now it's a little bit of a bummer that we're seeing this giant piece of watermelon because ideally that would have been okay to eat at one point. And there's so many resources that go into growing our food and getting our food to our table that we really want to get that into somebody's mouth as fuel for our body if we can. But I'm still really glad that whoever had that watermelon still did the next best thing, which was bring it over to the compost site and drop it off so that we could use this as a nitrogen source for our compost.
So Kathryn, we have a couple questions from that. Classroom wants to know, do you have to use fruit? And then Ms. Updal's class wants to know, how do the compost help plants grow?
Yeah, so the first one, do we have to use fruit? No, we can take like meat, fruit, vegetables, even like you'll notice sometimes people bag their items in paper bags. Again, paper is made from trees, so it's made of an organic material, and that's totally fine to include with your kitchen scraps. You can put egg waste as well in there. Eggshells are great for compost. So really, again, any kind of food scraps, even if it's moldy, that's totally fine. Can go in here. So great question.
Yeah,
and then,
we have one more question, and I think it kind of relates to where you were going to go next. Mr. Randall's class wants to know, how long does it take for those kitchen scraps to decompose and be part of the compost?
Yeah, so the overall composting process that happens in this barn behind me, which we'll get into the details in a second here, takes a month or two. Kind of depends on how much food waste we get in, because as I'll show you later, we kind of build up a stockpile before we mix and kind of start the timer on the compost process. But yeah, starting all the way from this dumpster to the final product is probably about 2 months. But it doesn't take long, let me tell you, for this dumpster to get really stinky, especially in like the hot summer. This organic dumpster is probably the stinkiest part of the process. And so that's why I'll show you in a second, we move it into the barn behind us about once a week and add it to our stockpile just to clear this dumpster and make it a little more pleasant for the residents that are using it. But back to the question about how compost helps plants grow. Is the decayed organic matter breaks all the way down into tiny little molecules that plants can use as food, versus a plant may not have the best time growing straight out of this watermelon because the structure of that watermelon and how it grew up hasn't broken down enough and hasn't released enough of those small molecules for those plants to grow. So yeah, so now we've talked about kind of our recipe, our carbon and our nitrogen. And like I mentioned, we create a stockpile about once a week. This dumpster gets dumped, so you should be shown a video right now on your screen of that dumpster being pulled into the barn behind me and being dumped into our stockpile on the right side of this building. So we're just using a skid steer to lift that dumpster and bring it inside. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a few minutes, but it's really important that we collect enough volume of this waste before we kind of mix everything together and get the compost process started, because it's better the more material we have, the more mass. It's going to be a little less effective and maybe take a little bit longer if we have a smaller pile. And that'll make a little bit more sense in a minute here. But
yeah,
so
we
you've
had a
got,
couple
yeah,
questions, Kathryn, about are all of the organic or the food scraps from donations, or do you collect them from different sites, or how do you get all of those materials?
those are brought in by residents of Anoka County. Same with the yard waste that's brought into this site is all from local residents. So they just separate their food scraps in their kitchen. They bag them up using those special compostable bags, those green bags that you saw in the pile. I can show you one right here. Because again, commonly we use plastic bags for things, but plastic is an inorganic material. It's not something that we want in our pile and can actually contaminate our compost, which we definitely don't want. So we have those special bags. But after we dump in the food scraps onto this pile, then we also bring in some yard waste, again, that carbon source, and we dump it on the stockpile as well. So the videos that you're seeing right now, those were taken just a couple weeks ago. And luckily we were at the point where the pile was big enough that we were ready to mix it up and kind of get that compost process started. So there is some decay happening in the stockpile before it's all mixed, but we kind of kickstart that decay after everything is mixed. And you might, is that the mixing video? Okay, yeah. So you can see in that video right there of us mixing the pile. So we use this really cool contraption on the end of the skid steer that was actually designed for concrete mixing, but our really smart operations manager was like, I bet we could use that to mix compost. And he was definitely right. So it's got kind of this rotating arm in the middle that mixes up all the material, and then that breaks open these compostable bags to make sure that all their contents also get mixed throughout. And so you might have noticed, maybe 10 seconds ago on this video, when that skid steer took a fresh scoop of that pile, it looked like kind of a smoky haze was emitted from that pile. And so there you go. You can see that right above there. So, and that's not smoke, that's actually water vapor or steam, because like I said, there is some decay happening in this pile and it actually starts to build up heat. But where is the heat coming from? So back to our cake analogy, if humans were the chefs, we've got our recipe of carbon and nitrogen, then, I mean, we need an oven to bake the cake, right? But here in this processing barn, I mean, that video was taken a couple weeks ago. It was like 70 degrees outside, not particularly warm. The barn we're in isn't heated at all. But actually, the cool part about where the heat is coming from is that's coming from the microorganisms that are at work doing the decay. So they heat up that pile as they're eating. So the microorganisms at play are bacteria and fungus, and they are eating all of the yard waste and the food waste and breaking it down into those small molecules that eventually plants can use to grow. So again,
Related
it
to
doesn't
that sort
look,
of,
yeah.
Kathryn, related to that, Ms. Allman has a student in her class who wants to know if you add any worms to composting.
We don't add any worms, but definitely like if you're composting in a pile like in your backyard, or there is a practice called vermicomposting, and verma that comes from the Latin root for worm. Worms are great at eating up material and expelling those smaller molecules that are good for plants. So worms are definitely helpful in certain systems. We just don't utilize them here at the Rice Creek compost site for our composting system. We're relying mostly on bacteria and fungus, and those bacteria and fungi actually come in naturally with the yard waste and the food waste, which is pretty cool. So we don't have to add anything to our pile. We just mix together our recipe, get it mixed, and then they're already ready to get going decaying. So
we had a couple questions, Kathryn, about, you were talking about the temperature, about things heating up. And Miss
yes.
Bishop's class wants to know, does it ever get too warm that you could potentially start a fire?
Ooh, well, the key here is we always keep this pile wet. We'll show you a video right now of us just using a simple garden hose to make sure that this pile stays damp, because just like us, these microorganisms need water in order to stay hydrated, in order to keep on eating and keep on decaying this material. So fire risk is not really something we're too worried about because this material stays damp all the time. But you can take a look. We have these cool temperature probes. They're really long here. I'll pull it out really quick. You can see just how long this temperature probe is. And it goes all the way into the center of the pile, so we can kind of monitor the microbial activity. So you can see right now in this pile, it is about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So very nice and toasty in there. And that means that we know that the microbes are happy, they're at work. And the reason they create all that heat is like the same reason that a room gets warmer, you know, when a bunch of people come in, because all of our body heat kind of adds up together and makes the room warmer. So it's the same concept at play here. So
we had a question from Miss
yeah.
Lightfoot's class. They're wondering, why is the compost brown in color?
Yeah, so that's just, I guess, the natural color that it turns when everything starts to break down. You can see in this fresh pile, you know, we've got like pieces of grass. They kind of start to brown, same with like our leaf material. So the chlorophyll that makes leaves and grass green to begin with, that's kind of the first thing to start breaking down in this process. So it starts to lose that green color and look brown. And then same with our food waste, those color pigments, even like the red color pigments in that watermelon, they're pretty fragile. So once they start breaking down, everything starts to lose its color and turn that brown color. You can see the same thing here with all these dried leaves. We'll be seeing more and more of these now that it's fall. Maybe the leaves fall and they're nice and bright red, but over, you know, a week or two, that red color diminishes for that same reason. So it's just those color molecules are pretty fragile and they break down really easily, and then everything just looks brown at the end.
That's a great explanation. Thanks, Kathryn. We've had a number of questions about just the time, the length of time that it takes to create compost. So roughly or approximately, how long has that pile you're standing next to been, you know, decomposing or composting?
Yeah, so the videos we showed you earlier where we were adding the last bit to our stockpile, that stockpile was about 2 weeks old. It's been about 2 or 3 weeks since that video was taken. So you can see how far along in this process we are, maybe less than a month into this process. Now we do have 2 other piles in our processing barn. This one in the middle, you can see, you know, we can still see some sticks and we can see some compostable bags that still need to be broken down, but overall the material is a lot finer. This is probably about, I would guess, like a month and a half old. And again, if we take a look at the temperature on this, it's a little less warm than the original one, but it's still in that nice green active phase. It's about 130 degrees Fahrenheit. So a little less microbial activity just because their food source is diminishing, but that's about a month and a half old. And then we make our way over to our final pile here in our processing barn. This is at least 2 months old. And you can see everything is much more uniform than the last 2 piles. There's still some like clumps of grass that never got broken up a little bit. This will probably get pulled out and put into another cycle. And if we take a look at our temperature, because the temperature correlates to microbial activity, we're not even quite hitting, it's like 85 degrees maybe, not quite 90 degrees. So that is a lot cooler than 140, 130 degrees. Again, those microbes are eating away. And as that food source diminishes, their populations lower, and then the heat that they're all generating lowers too, which is why it's a lower temperature. So this is about 2 months old.
And how much longer does it have until people could use it, could take it home and put it on their gardens or use it for plants to grow?
Yeah, so we need, just like going back to my cake analogy, just like when you take a cake out of the oven, you need to let it cool for a little bit before you can cut into it. Because if you cut into it too early, you're going to release a lot of steam that's trapped in there. The cake's going to dry out really fast. The structure is going to collapse, and you're going to end up with like a dry, dense cake, which nobody wants. So kind of like our compost, once the microbial activity lowers down, again, we use this temperature gauge to see kind of where that's at, but then it needs to sit or cool, or what we call curing, for a couple weeks to a month. And that helps kind of stabilize all of the chemical reactions that are going on in this pile. It makes sure that the microbial population has died down, that all the food has been eaten up, and then those tiny little molecules that, again, the plants really want to grow, that they're stable and they're good for use, because we don't want to put something unstable or unfinished on your garden. So again, it takes like 2 to 4 weeks to cure and stabilize at the end before it's ready for use.
Awesome. Okay, we have a few more questions. Miss
Mhm.
Almond's class is curious. They're wondering, are there any bacteria that are bad for plants that sometimes get into the compost? And what do you do about that?
Yeah, so great question, because I forgot to mention the other thing that those microorganisms need in order to be happy and eating and being well. They need oxygen. Just like we breathe oxygen, those bacteria and fungus need oxygen too. So we use that same like scoop function on the skid steer to mix those piles about once a week to make sure that oxygen gets in the middle. If we let those piles sit too long, then right in the middle of that pile, you're going to start having pockets where there's no oxygen. And then those kind of bad bacteria that thrive in conditions without oxygen, they come in, they start eating, but they decay the food in a way that we don't want, and that produces kind of a stinky, sludgy mess that we really don't want. Maybe you've seen kind of that stinky, sludgy mess like at the bottom of your kitchen garbage can. So those same bacteria we don't want. So that's what prevents us from getting those kind of bad bacteria, is just by making sure we aerate the pile on a regular basis.
So sort of related, Miss Bianchi's class is wondering, if they're from the Way Christian Academy, do you guys ever have a bug or fly problem while the compost is happening?
I don't think it's necessarily a problem. I mean, you probably saw in the barn, there's quite a few flies buzzing around. I mean, they're kind of annoying just as a human, but they're not really doing anything bad to the compost, and they're nothing we can really prevent because, I mean, these barn doors are open quite often, so it's like we're basically processing outside. And to a certain extent, I mean, the flies are utilizing that material and kind of helping with the decay just in a much smaller way than the bacteria. So not really a problem. I mean, obviously the decaying food matter might attract like some mice and things every once in a while, but they're just kind of something that is just par for the course at a composting site. So yeah, not really anything that's troublesome that we need to do anything about it. It's just kind of how it is.
Yeah, well, Kathryn, our time is flying by here. We have a few
Mhm.
questions. Miss Broman's class,
Yeah.
Miss Cole's class. They want to know, what do you do with the compost when it's ready? So that looks like the pile that you're standing by.
Yep.
What happens now?
Yep. So this pile is totally cured. It's nice and stable. We do offer this unscreened compost free to our residents, but when we're selling commercially, we do screen this compost. So you should be seeing a quick video of our screener on the screen. And it's basically this rotating drum where we put this finished compost through, all the fine particles fall to the bottom and get pushed into a nice pile. And then those bigger chunks, like those twigs or like that grass clump that didn't quite break down, all of that will get filtered out. So it could either be put into a new cycle of compost, or sometimes we're filtering out like plastic pieces, unfortunately, which we get a lot of. And because we don't screen until after the composting process, it's really important that we're really careful about what we're putting into the compost. So we'll do that screen, but again, after the curing is done, I mean, this is ready for use in your garden. It's ready for use, MnDOT, like I said, uses a lot of this for their road construction projects. Like, it's ready to go once it's cured and once it's stabled. The screening process is just kind of an added bonus to remove those contaminants, remove those large sticks and stuff like that to get a finer product like I showed you at the beginning.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Kathryn. I have one final question for you. What if students or schools that are tuning in today, what if they want to start a composting at their school? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so composting at schools can be a really fun class activity. If you have a school garden, that's a really great place to start, especially if you're able to get food scraps from your school cafeteria that you can mix in with the garden waste coming from your garden. Otherwise, schools can also participate in composting programs like off-site, as long as they can collect that stuff on site. So if you learned about compost today and you're really excited about getting involved in composting, definitely let your teachers and your principals know. Your local county or the city that your school is in, or the school district, they might have programs available for you to get started on composting to help with some of the education and the setup costs. So definitely reach out to local counties and cities for ways to get involved.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathryn. Well, we are so lucky to have you share with us this whole recipe of creating compost and showing us all the steps along the way. We are so thankful. And we're thankful for all the students and teachers who tuned in. I apologize, I couldn't ask all your questions. We just are running out of time. But thank you for being engaged and thinking about all of those fantastic things that you wanted to know. Teachers, I want to let you know that we're having 2 more virtual field trips in the next 2 weeks. So next Friday, October 6th, we're visiting a cranberry farm in Wisconsin. We're partnering with our Wisconsin Ag in the Classroom friends. So that's going to be very exciting to visit a cranberry farm. And then on Wednesday, October 11th, we're going to visit Fireside Orchard and Gardens and learn about how apples are grown near Northfield. And they're also going to be pressing those apples into making cider. So we're excited to bring those fun experiences to you guys via Zoom or YouTube. So thanks again, Kathryn, for being an awesome host. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. We hope you have a great Monday.